leaves, gardening for caterpillars and other insects. And whenever I see something like this is leaf damage on one of my plants in my garden. It's a literal and figurative holy experience. It's always makes me really happy because it means that my garden is contributing to the ecosystem. So having plants get eaten, a lot of people don't like that, but for me it's a holy experience, and something that really makes me happy. This talk is really just a simple talk. I wouldn't call myself a gardening expert. There's a lot of things I don't know, but I really like insects, and I've been gardening for insects now for, this would be about the 4th year that I've been kind of messing around. This is my garden in Peterborough. So my parents bought this place and they let me tear up the lawn and create this garden. This is the garden last early July, so it's in its 2nd year from seed. So anyway, but I'll talk a little bit more about how I created this garden, but this is sort of where I'm jumping off from. So I created this garden to kind of bring nature home for my family, and kind of bring pollinators to them. They're not the most outdoorsy people, so it's bringing insects and bringing nature to them. And that's sort of what really inspires me and what kind of has got me going on. But first off, why use native plants? So if you're a member of the Peterborough Field Naturalists, I probably don't need to sell you on native plants. Many of you probably have your own native plant gardens. Many of you probably know more about gardening than I do. But for those that don't know, native plants are incredibly important. They're the foundation of our ecosystems. Our native insects have evolved over millennia to feed often on specific plants. We usually think of the monarch butterfly with the milkweed, but so many other insects are like that. You have oak caterpillars that only feed on oak, and cherry species that feed on cherries, and etc. 90% of insects that we have roughly feed on native plants. And then many of these are specialists. So often, particularly when we think about bees, you often have bees that are specialist pollinators that will visit one type of flower and only that type of flower. And if that flower disappears, the specialist disappears. Non-native plants and ornamentals often don't provide enough food for insects. So some non-native and ornamental plants are good to have in your garden, or maybe don't have much of a negative impact. But there's been studies that have been coming out now showing that ornamental plants and even cultivars of native plants don't provide the necessarily nutrition for insects, so the right amount of proteins or amino acids, that sort of thing. So really going with pure native plants is important from a nutritional perspective for insects. These plants support birds by supporting insects and providing shelter. 96% of terrestrial birds feed their young insects. So birds like the goldfinch feed their young seeds, but most other birds are feeding their young insects. So insects need native plants, for the food chain. In addition to that, 1 in 8 bird species are threatened with extinction globally, and this will of course increase as time goes on. So native plants are as important now as they've ever have been. So it's a very important thing to start thinking about. Also, when we talk about native plants, particularly berry plants, even species like New England aster and milkweed, they have these incredibly deep root systems. So if you look at turf grass, that's just a very shallow root system. But even common plants, New England aster, common milkweed, you can see in this graph from the Meadowway, they have roots that go down 4 meters sometimes or more, and that really helps to hold soil in place and stop soil erosion. It also helps to trap surface water. So instead of having, so when it comes to floods and stuff like that, the water will go down and be sort of held in those roots instead of just flooding off and causing damage during rainstorms. So having native plants is really important, reducing stuff like runoff in cities. So when we look at Peterborough from Google Earth, you see a lot of gray space. Peterborough is interesting because we have this city core, and then we're surrounded by open farm fields, which are just completely barren and not really good pollinator habitat at all. You have hedgerows along these farm fields that are good habitat, and then you have these patches of green space The largest being the Trenton Wildlife Sanctuary to the north of the Riverview Park and Zoo. But what we have in Peterborough is, and I guess just in any urban area, is this really good opportunity to use native plants to help connect these green spaces. So if each of those little tiny gray dots has a selection of native plants, then these green spaces can get connected really easily. And we can actually have sometimes greater pollinator diversity and abundance in a city than in an agricultural area or outside in one of those green spaces. So it's a really cool opportunity to really green up the city of Peterborough. When we think about choosing plants, I want to talk a little bit about choosing plants. We often think about ecoregions. So this is sort of showing the Peterborough plant hardiness zone. We're in hardiness zone 5A and B. But that doesn't really mean that the plants that are hardy to this area are native to Peterborough. If you want to know what plants are really native to Peterborough, we should look at what our ecoregion is. So we are ecoregion 6E. In ecoregion 6E, there's a high density of rock barrens, alvars, and drumlins. There's sedge marshes, old farm fields, swamps, mixed woodlands. And historically, we had oak savanna and tallgrass prairie. Only in small areas, and only in areas that were maintained by indigenous peoples for the most part. There's a 1/1000% left in ecoregion 6E, but we historically did have some tallgrass prairies. And so when we think about designing a garden, often we have these areas where we have lawns or we have, dry, hot areas that we need to put plants in. So when we think, so that's an area that sort of mimics or is similar to what oak savanna and tallgrass prairies would be, or the type of habitat that would allow for oak savanna and tallgrass species to live. So what am I trying to get at here? Basically, think outside of the woodland, essentially. We often think of woodland plants and trees and shrubs and stuff like that, but prairie plants have as much of a place in Peterborough as they do anywhere else in Ontario. So cool. I wanted to talk a little bit about Scott's Plains. So for those that don't know, Peterborough used to be a prairie. Historically, there was a prairie in Peterborough. Catherine Partrill described the land around Peterborough as plains forming a natural park with isolated pines and oaks and poplars. Samuel Strickland described several hundred acres of open plain in Peterborough in the 1800s. And if we look at this is a map, a really good publication, Tallgrass Prairies and Savannas in the Kawarthas by Basil Bukowski. I would recommend checking that out if you want to learn more about this subject. But these red areas that are circled are all historical tallgrass prairie and savanna habitats. Most of this is completely gone. The red area in Peterborough used to be called Scott's Plains. And then in the south, we have the Rice Lake Plains. Most of those prairies, you can see extensive coverage of prairies, but most of those are gone. The largest, most intact remnant is the Alderville Black Oak Savanna, which is the yellow star down in the bottom corner. So to look where Scott's Plains is over a map, Scott's Plains was roughly downtown Peterborough. So if you live in downtown Peterborough, prairie plants are native to that area. And what are prairie plants? So the most intact remnant of prairie closest to Peterborough is the Alderville Black Oak Savanna. I was there a couple times volunteering this summer, and it's just this open flat. It looks like it goes on forever. It only goes on for about 100 acres or so, 100 hectares or so. But it looks like it just goes on forever. And it's this beautiful mixture of tall prairie grasses like big blue stem, shrubs like New Jersey tea, round-headed bush clover, early goldenrod, these species that like kind of harsh conditions and like to grow out and bake in the sun, and that are all perfect additions to a garden in Peterborough. Species like showy tick trefoil. It's not the best photo. I didn't include the best photo of showy tick trefoil, but I wanted to kind of show its form because you have this kind of drift of showy tick trefoil where it's this rich green foliage and then these pink blossoms that are really attractive to bees. And that was just everywhere at the Black Oak Savanna. Same with woodland sunflower, butterfly weed, and also native field thistle. So most thistles that you come across, including the Canadian thistle, are all non-native, But at the Black Oak Savanna, there's our native species, Cirsium discolor, field thistle, which is just a wonderful plant. It gets 8 to 10 feet tall and is just covered in bees. Such an awesome plant. All right, so I got almost all of my garden inspiration from looking at and researching the Black Oak Savanna, but alvars are another open habitat that we have in our Peterborough ecoregion 6E. This alvar was at Callahan Rapids, which is east of Peterborough near Marmora. There are lots of these limestone alvars, and you might be wondering what an alvar is. So an alvar is basically this area of limestone pavement with really thin soil, and it creates this open environment that's really good for a variety of uniquely adapted plants. Often it's speckled with junipers. This area you can see the junipers, reindeer lichen, and then different species of wildflowers kind of make a home in the cracks and on the loose soil. So some of these shrubs that I was finding on alvars last year include species like northern prickly ash, which is the host plant for the giant swallowtail, fragrant sumac, common juniper, red cedar, buffalo berry, New Jersey tea. All of these species grow really well in rocky alvar conditions. So if you're thinking, well, what is my garden like in alvar? I planted a lot of these alvar species next to the sidewalk on my garden. So they were growing kind of next to these calcium-rich sidewalk stones, which are kind of providing a similar condition to alvars. So these are all, good plants that you can plant. Narrow-leaf New Jersey tea and smooth rose grow in these alvars together. Prairie cinquefoil is another one. Wood lily. If you can get wood lily, it's one of our native lilies. They take a long time to flower, but if you can source them, they're a really good addition to the garden. The swallowtail butterflies really love them. Wild columbine, hairy beard tongue. These are both great additions if you have a rocky, dry area that is just getting a lot of sun, and a lot of plants might not grow there. Wild columbine and hairy beard tongue probably will, and they're loved by bees. So now I want to talk a little bit about the importance of insect diversity. Insects are very important. Obviously, they're the biological foundation of our terrestrial ecosystems, and they're relying mostly on these native plants to survive. Many plants I talked about earlier are pollinated by specialist insects. So there are a lot. So if insect diversity goes down, those specialists often are the first ones to disappear. Just a couple of stats for you. 35% of crop production relies on insect pollinators. And that number I think is pretty low, because a lot of, if you think about meat, a lot of cattle are fed alfalfa, and alfalfa is pollinated by insects. So I think that number is even higher if you factor in animal feed that's being pollinated by insects as well. 89% of birds are fed by pollinators or insects, which we talked about earlier. And a cool stat, this is out of Doug Ptolemy's book, Bringing Nature Home, is that it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed one nest of black-capped chickadees. This has been a study that's been replicated a lot of times, and it holds true. And it's just absolutely amazing. So for those chickadees to be able to find enough caterpillars, they have to have a really high diversity of insects, and a high diversity of insects are feeding on a high diversity of native plants, essentially is what I'm getting at. Now, evidence is showing lately that insects are declining. A 2020 study found that since 1990, terrestrial insects have declined globally by about 9% per decade, and abundance has decreased by 12% in freshwater insects. So insects are declining pretty heavily. There's one of the most studied. It was one of the most cited studies back when this came out in 2017. But in Germany, there was this area, this forest in Germany where they had been sampling insects since the 80s. They found a seasonal decline of 76% at this area. So biomass over 20 years had declined by 76% in this one site. That was due to a lot of reasons. There was agricultural area surrounding it, so they think it was habitat fragmentation and a whole bunch of other factors that contributed to this. And the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation lists that they cite 28% of bumblebee species and 17% of butterfly species in North America are at risk of extinction. Here in Ontario, we have 23 species of insect listed as species at risk for various different levels, but that number, 23 insect species, is probably lower than what it actually is, but those are just the ones that we have the good data for. And then anecdotal evidence, the windshield phenomenon, is the idea that back in the day, our windshields used to have more dead insects on them, and nowadays we're not finding as many dead insects, and that's because insects have declined. So that's just anecdotal evidence, but I mean, I know that when I was a kid, we used to always stop at the car wash to wash the insects off the car, and you don't really do that anymore. So whether this is because insects are declining or because cars are more aerodynamic and insects are just getting swooped over the windshield, I don't really know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. So what threats are insects facing? There are hundreds of threats facing them. Climate change, habitat loss, competition from invasive species. So that includes invasive insects that might feed on different insect species, invasive plants that take over, habitat fragmentation. An interesting cause of insect decline, particularly Lepidoptera, are white-tailed deer. So they might not be the most important cause of decline, but white-tailed deer, if you look over here, this is a forest in Peterborough with white-tailed deer. In Peterborough, we have our forests are so fragmented, and we have these agricultural fields growing corn, and so our deer numbers are way higher than they would not be naturally, and that's the case pretty much everywhere in Ontario. But in Peterborough, where we have a high abundance of deer, you get this browse line, and so what could have been maybe a forest that was rich in vegetation has now been kind of decimated by deer. And when deer eat plants, they're also eating any caterpillars or eggs that are on there. So in sensitive areas, particularly alvars, prairies, stuff like that, if you have too many white-tailed deer, they come in there and they can really affect plant diversity. In Algonquin Park, where there's really no white-tailed deer, the forests look like this. Algonquin, there's moose, but not white-tailed deer. And white-tailed deer are there, but they're nowhere near as abundant as they are in Peterborough. So in Algonquin, you don't get that browse line, but in Peterborough, you do. So that could potentially cause some insects to decline. And it's not obviously not the deer's fault. The deer are abundant because of humans altering the habitat, but they can affect insects as well. Another thing to consider in insect declines is light pollution. So 2016 meta-analysis, they found that warm LED light bulbs attract the least amount of insects. So if you have a porch light and you don't want to be attracting insects and causing moths and other insects to fly to your light and then have them die there, get eaten by birds, you can use a warm LED light bulb and that'll attract the least amount of insects. They found that incandescent bulbs attracted the most. So avoid using incandescent outdoor lights. Also, mercury vapor outdoor lights will attract a large amount of insects as well. So avoiding that can kind of help decrease light pollution and will sort of help. You don't want your gardening efforts to kind of backfire and you're just attracting insects to your lights so that they die. So changing light bulbs is small little change that we can do to help insect populations. So ways to support insects in the gardens. There's really only a few types of insects that I'm going to talk about. One of those is dragonflies. Species like the Halloween pennant here will breed readily in backyard ponds. So if you have a large enough space in your backyard to create a pond, especially one with a muddy bottom, and a variety of plants like pickerel weed or some shrubs like nannyberry, red osier dogwood, you can create habitat for dragonflies and damselflies. There's a few species like, as I said, the Halloween pennant that will breed in these aquatic in backyard ponds. And so even a small pond will attract dragonflies. And then when it comes to other insects, I'm really only going to talk about bees and moths, because if you're planting for bees and moths, you're going to be benefiting almost all other kinds of insects, flies, beetles, they're all going to be attracted to these plants. So I'm going to just kind of go over a few plants that are really good at attracting bees and are really good at attracting moths. When we think about bees, there's a lot of different species of bees. In Ontario, there's over 400 species of bees. they're very hard to identify, but really what you need to think about when you're designing your gardens is that we have 3 types of bees. We have bees that nest in the ground, bees that nest in stems, and bees that nest in cavities. So if you understand this and you garden in a way that allows for these bees to complete their life cycles, you'll be golden. So ground nesting bees, like the cellophane bee here. Ground nesting bees will nest in bare soil. Cellophane bees like this often nest in these loose kind of aggregations. They just sort of all nest together in dry, open, sandy soil. I found colonies of ground nesting bees in lawns a few times. One place to find them, there's a Nichols Oval. I've seen them in the lawns there. Also, there's the train tracks near Beavermead in Peterborough. And also the beach at Beavermead is a great place to see cellophane bees. But all these areas are kind of dry, sandy slopes that are bare and have bare soil. And this will be, and so these bees will nest in your dry, sandy soil. And including these areas in your garden can help out. One ways to include bare soil is to plant bunch grasses. So species like switchgrass, they'll form a nice bunch and they flop over like this. And then often what they do is they create this kind of wave, and underneath those plants are bare soil. And some species like sweat bees and stuff like that will nest in the bare soil around these plants. So it's important to keep bare soil for ground nesting bees. Stem nesting bees nest in stems. These are the bees that often, when you see those bee condos that are really popular, they're trying to attract stem nesting bees. But bee condos come with a lot of problems. You have to replace the stems, and you have to replace the stems at the right time, or else you're causing, the potential for diseases and stuff like that. So really planting the right plants gets rid of all those problems. You know what I mean? It might not be as cute as a little bee box, but planting the right plants will support stem nesting bees in a much more natural and much more sanitary way. So some of these plants include raspberries, elderberry. One of the best ones are wild bergamot, New England aster. Yellow coneflower and purple coneflower are not native to the Peterborough area, but they have great stems. Like if you crack, like once those stems are dry, you crack them open and it's literally just a big open tube. So planting these flowers and then not cutting them down, if you have a garden with native plants, you want to leave the stems up. It looks something like this. So this is, I just took this online from Heather Holm, who writes, who has a great series on pollinator, a great series of books on pollinators. But I want to show you this to just kind of get the visual. So in winter, you have dead stems, the first year. Then spring, summer, bees will lay their eggs and pollen balls and create pollen balls in these stems and seal them up. And then the next year, the bees will hibernate over winter, and then the next year they emerge. So it's a 2-year process. You grow your, you leave the dead heads, the dead plants up during winter, you cut them in the spring. In the summer, plants grow up and kind of hide the stems. And then bees are laying eggs in the stems, which then emerge the following spring, if that makes sense. So it took me a little bit to get this, because you want to cut everything down, but if you're growing these plants and then you're just cutting them down, you're kind of defeating the purpose of growing these plants, because you're destroying bee habitat or potentially killing bees while they're hibernating in the stems. So one thing people ask a lot of the time is when the best time to clean your garden is. And the real answer is to just sort of leave messy bits in your garden. You don't need to leave all the stems up, but leaving certain areas where you don't cut the stems or you don't get rid of the leaf litter is really important for bees, because there's bees and other insects hanging out in the messy parts of your garden year round. Here's that picture from the beginning, the Holey leaves. This is showy tick trefoil, and it's a favorite of leaf cutting bees. So those holes were actually cut by leaf cutting bees. They'll visit the showy tick trefoil, which is a type of legume, and they cut those wedges out, and then they bring them back to their nest and make these little kind of they'll make these they'll look like little burritos. They'll make this little burrito and lay a pollen ball in there, and then lay an egg on that, which then feeds, and the next year emerges as an adult leaf cutting bee. So when it comes to stem nesting bees, planting species like showy tick trefoil and legumes and plants that they like to use the leaves of is very important as well. Right. Now, so we talked about ground nesting bees and stem nesting bees, and now I just want to talk a little bit about bumblebees. I just got this graphic from Wisconsin bumblebees. It's just a really good, easy graphic that shows the life cycle of our bees. So bumblebees nest in cavities, usually a rodent burrow or something like that. During the winter, the queen is hibernating, usually underneath leaf litter or roots or underneath a rock, someplace secure. And then in spring, she's coming up and foraging. So spring forage flowers are very important for bumblebees. In this case, this one's feeding on Dutchman's breeches. But any springtime flowering plants like Dutchman's breeches or Virginia bluebells, strawberry, plum trees, stuff like this are really important for bees because they're foraging and drinking nectar and kind of building up their fat reserves. Then in early summer, our queen bumblebee finds a place to make a nest, usually a rodent burrow. A couple years ago at my parents' place, we had a chickadee box that we put up, and the chickadees nested in that and ended up nesting that whole thing, nested, and then once the young were gone, they abandoned the nest, but they left that old mossy nest behind, and Queen Bumblebee found that and actually made a nest in the bird box. So sometimes keeping old bird box houses like that are good for bumblebees as well. They might take advantage of it. Then in early summer, our queen bumblebee she's collecting pollen and nectar and creating these pollen pots to feed her young. In late summer and fall, the numbers of workers increase. Late fall, the queens mate, and then the queens overwinter in leaf litter. So that's the life cycle of bumblebees. Bumblebees are one of our more studied pollinators. The yellow-banded bumblebee is a species at risk. They've declined by 70% in 20 years. The American bumblebee is another species at risk as well. And both of these can be found in the Peterborough area and can be can be supported by planting pollinator gardens. So again, I said this earlier, but Xerces Society lists 28% of bumblebee species and 17% of butterfly species in North America at risk of extinction. So when it comes to that, we should remember that when we're talking about supporting native bees, we're not really talking about honeybees. Honeybees, there's nothing really wrong with honeybees, but the issue is that when we think about bee conservation, we often think about honeybees first. But honeybees aren't native, they're not at risk, and they can potentially outcompete our native bees. When we say they're not at risk, there's been, of course, obviously, we know about honeybee declines, colony collapse disorder, and stuff like that. But honeybees are an agricultural product. They're an agricultural product of agriculture, and declines in honeybees are they're an agricultural issue. Often due to mismanagement or lack of forage. But really a lot of people think, that they're saving the bees by starting by beekeeping. And in a place like Peterborough, if you start setting up beehives in the middle of Peterborough where we're surrounded by all that gray space and then all those empty barren fields of corn, introducing honeybees can be a bit of a negative thing. A study came out in 2016 that found that a 40 hive apiary of bumblebees extracts the pollen resources of 4 million native bees over 3 months in the summer. Single hive consumption. So if we're talking about one hive of honeybees, in one summer, they're consuming up to 30 pounds of pollen and up to 330 pounds and up to 900 pounds of nectar. And when we're looking at Peterborough, that gray space where there's no flowers, just a few hives of honeybees can have a pretty big impact. There's also evidence that honeybees spread diseases to bumblebees as well. There's been studies that show that the virus, like different pathogen levels are higher around honeybee hives than they are outside of honeybee hives. So there's pathogen spillover and all these dirty issues that come up when you start introducing, hives of hundreds of thousands of bees into areas. that can't really support them. So when we're thinking about saving our bees, we're thinking about our native bees and not necessarily honeybees. Nothing wrong with beekeeping or anything like that, but it's just if we're trying to, it's like keeping chickens to save the birds. You know what I mean? Right. Another thing we hear about as well is that people, like No Mow May has been a popular kind of campaign where the idea is to not mow the grass in May so that flowers like dandelions can be encouraged. And this is great. Dandelion are forage for bees. Here we have bumblebees feeding on dandelions. But often when we have dandelions in an area, they might be the only thing flowering, but in our gardens, we can save dandelions. We have to understand that they're not the best forage for bees. The best forage for bees are our native plants. Dandelions are non-native. They're visited by bumblebees in their native Europe. So they're producing some resources, but they're not producing the best. These flowers here are producing some of the best ones. So this is just a whole bunch of different species that I've listed that are native to the Peterborough area and that are wonderful for bees. I'll just leave it up for a second if anybody wants to screenshot it. I can go back to this later on, but this is just a few different species that are flowering from the beginning of spring all the way to the fall. And I'll talk a little bit about a few of my favorite ones in this next slide. All right, pussy willow is one of the earliest flowering plants. If you can plant pretty much any willow, if you have room and you can plant a willow, that's going to produce an abundance of nectar and pollen resources for bees. I photographed this yellow-banded bumblebee visiting a willow in Haliburton a couple weeks ago. But willows tend to get a little bit big for most landscape areas. If you plant it kind of too close to a septic or too close to your house, their roots can be aggressive and they'll seek water. So it's something you might want to not plant in a small landscape, but if you have a large landscape or a wet area in your lawn, you can even just go and cut twigs of willows. If you have willows growing in ditches nearby, cut a few twigs and just stick them in the ground and they'll root really easily. I did this a couple times, and just in the wild, I've trying to plant willows in different areas where they weren't growing, and they've rooted really well with just me cutting a stick and putting it in the ground and walking away. So willows can potentially be free, and they are a great source for bees. Plums and cherries bloom next. So this is Canada plum with a bald-faced hornet visiting it. Plums and cherries are one of the most important ones that you can have for bees. They have an abundance of flowers that bloom early in the season and are visited by a lot of different pollinators. Smooth rose is another good one. It's a widespread native rose. They're buzz pollinated by bees. So these flowers only provide pollen resources for bees, and bees visit them and buzz pollinate them, release all that pollen, and then collect that and go back to their nests. New Jersey tea is a really, really good one as well. Buttonbush is a great plant. It gets 6 to 12 feet tall and grows mostly in wet areas, but it blooms in July when not a lot of other shrubs are blooming. Wild strawberry, I use this one as green mulch. So green mulch I have in my gardens, it's basically just like I use plants that spread really well, and they kind of take the area, take away, I use them basically as mulch. So where you would have mulch to kind of keep weeds and suppress weeds and kind of keep areas around plants clear, I use plants like wild strawberry. Virginia waterleaf is another good plant. This is one of the most important ones for bumblebees. They can spread aggressively in shady areas, but that's okay for me. I have a shady area and I have a lot of these Virginia waterleaf plants growing, and they make great green mulch. Foxglove beard tongue is another great source for bees. It's a pollen and nectar source. Milkweeds are really good. Milkweeds are pretty much one of the most essential plants when it comes to insects. You can grow them easily, just common milkweed seed. You can collect them in pretty much any open area, and then they'll grow from that. We have a lot of different species that grow in different areas. So swamp milkweed if you have a wet area, Sullivan's milkweed and butterfly weed if you have an open dry area, and poke milkweed that grows in the shade. The nectar that milkweeds provide is very rich in nutrition, so it's really, really good for bees. Wild bergamot is another great one for bees. And any mint, they bloom from July to August and are a great nectar source for bees. Black-eyed Susans, Rudbeckia species, are really important as well. I like to kind of combine wild bergamot and black-eyed Susan together, because the wild bergamot is providing nectar and then the black-eyed Susans are providing pollen, and you kind of have both those resources together. Common evening primrose is an absolutely wonderful plant. It's really easy to collect from seed. It grows pretty much everywhere once you learn what the seed heads look like. I'll show a picture of them later on. But I grew all my evening primrose just from a few seed heads. They have excellent germination. You can scatter them in an area of your lawn, in an area of your yard, and they will come back. They're biennial, so they often don't really flower in their first year, but they'll flower in the second year, lay seed down, and then die. But they're a wonderful nectar and pollen source for bees. Field thistle, I mentioned this one earlier. It's one of our native thistle species. It's also biennial. So it'll flower in its second year and then die. But if you can get your hands on it, it's a really, really cool native plant. It differs from our non-native thistles in that the underside of the leaves are kind of like a whitish color, whereas our non-native thistles are green. Also, no garden is, if no garden's complete, if you can grow 3 species, grow milkweed, goldenrod, and aster. Goldenrods and asters bloom late into the season and provide pollen, nectar resources for the last developing queen bumblebees. So they'll visit these, they'll collect nectar, and then use that to overwinter. So having large amounts of goldenrods and asters are really important to ensure that our queen bumblebees are able to survive the winter and then emerge in the spring. A few plants that are good for supporting wasps. I find plants that have kind of large, flat heads of flowers are really, really good. So species like milkweed and common yarrow, common boneset. This potter wasp is visiting flat-top white aster in my garden. Flat-top white aster is great. Common boneset is probably the wasp plant. If you want to plant something to attract wasps. When I say it like that, it sounds kind of bad, like, oh no, you're planting stuff to attract wasps, but wasps are beneficial insects. Wasps differ from bees in that bees are feeding their young nectar, feeding their young pollen, but bees are feeding their young caterpillars and grasshoppers and actual other insects. So these guys are sort of, they help to keep populations of caterpillars and other insects in check. So they're beneficial that way. They're like the alpha predators of that environment. So planting these flowers are really good and will help to attract wasps in your garden. And then they will in turn hopefully keep your vegetable gardens free of caterpillar damage. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about host plants for caterpillars. Bringing Nature Home by Doug Ptolemy. If you haven't read this book, definitely go out and get it. It's amazing. But these are the top 15 species that he lists for the Northeast ordered by number of species of Lepidoptera that they support. So oak is number 1, then next is cherry, and then willows. We talked a little bit about how important cherries are for bees, but they're also very important for moths. Birch is on there, poplar, crabapple, maple. Blueberry, you might not think of blueberry as being a moth host plant, but blueberry is a moth host plant as well. And when we think of the importance of Lepidoptera, so bees are important because they're pollinating plants and they're pollinating our crops. Caterpillars are important for a lot of reasons, but because they're also many of our birds that we love are feeding their young caterpillars. So if we plant these plants in our garden, we'll be able to produce more caterpillars and then produce more birds. So I'm going to go over a few of my favorite plants. Number 1 is oak. So oaks are listed as supporting 534 species. 2 of those that are really showy are the pink-striped oakworm and the spiny oak slug. These guys, often Lepidopteran diversity, caterpillar diversity tends to be higher on small plants. So when it comes to oaks, oaks take a long time to grow. But if you have an area on your property that you can maybe plant a hedge of oaks, you can have this short mounding hedge of oaks. And Lepidoptera tend to prefer to feed on young plants. I don't know if it's really fully understood why that is. If it's because the leaves are more are just more appealing to them, or if it's the size of the shape. It's probably a lot of different reasons. But planting young oaks is really, really good for caterpillar diversity. Oak beauties also feed on oaks. Wild cherries and plums are reported as hosting 456 species. This is a Canada plum. Our eastern tent caterpillars will feed on cherries. A lot of people don't like seeing this, but this is something that I love to see. It means that your garden is a part of the ecosystem. These are tent caterpillars feeding on a plum and cherry. But also cherries are host plants for moths like the Io moth and the Cecropia moths. Also butterflies like the white admiral will host on cherries. So planting cherries will hopefully attract not just tent caterpillars, but also Cecropias and white admirals as well. Willows host about the same amount as cherries. Pussy willow, swamp willow, they're host plants for moths like the rare willow ghost moth. Also the willow fairy moth visits the willow flowers early in the season. They're absolutely beautiful. They're like a little tiny, like a metallic purple with these really huge long horns. They're only about that big. And they'll visit the flowers of willows early in the season. So not just the caterpillars, but also the adult moths. Aspens and poplars, the Luna moth hosts on paper birch. So planting paper birch will hopefully produce Luna moths. Other ones, big poplar sphinx, they'll feed on big tooth aspen. Morning cloak butterflies feed on a number of different plants. They'll feed on willows. These ones had completely devoured a balsam poplar. And again, this was a short tree. This was a tree that was only a few years old. It was about 6 feet tall, but it was absolutely covered in these morning cloak caterpillars, and they had stripped the entire tree bare. So you don't have to worry when it comes to supporting caterpillars and insects. You don't necessarily have to have a big mature tree. Young plants are supporting them sometimes better than large trees would. Maples, rosy maple moths and maple spamworms host on maple. A lot of different species host on maple, and a lot of them have maple in their name, like the rosy maple moth and the maple spamworm. These guys were both found in right next to a sugar maple beech forest where sugar maple was the most dominant tree. Also, the Polyphemus moth hosts on maple. This is one of my favorite moths to find, and if I set up a moth sheet near a maple forest, I almost always get Polyphemus moths. Pine is another really good one. You might not think of pine as being a caterpillar host plant, but it's a great caterpillar host plant for a lot of specialist species like the pine imperial moth, which lives exclusively in Ontario and Quebec. Northern pine sphinx also feeds on pine. Species like the false hemlock looper and the boreal pine looper also feed on pine. Basswood is a great plant. It hosts specialist insects like the basswood leaf roller. And to go back to bees, basswood flowers, they're absolutely wonderful for bees. They have this really strong scent, and they release a lot of nectar kind of late in the day. So they'll be visited at night by moths, and then bees will visit them early in the morning to get the rest of the nectar. So really, really good tree to have when it comes to floral resources. Dogwoods and viburnums are great plants to include in your garden. You can see on this round leaf dogwood all those holes in the leaves. So Holey leaves are what we want to have. And if you plant a dogwood or a viburnum, most of your leaves are going to have at least some holes in them. They're a great host plant for a lot of species. Not just moths, but also beetles feed on these as well. Sumacs are another good one. You might not think of sumacs as being a moth host plant, but species like the spotted titana, often the spotted titanas occur in these big congregations like the tent caterpillars, and they can clean a sumac pretty quickly. Also, the sumac flowers are really attractive to a number of pollinators, mostly flies, wasps, but also some moths and bees are attracted to them too. New Jersey tea is one of my favorite plants. It has these long corollas that are great for moths. They can kind of get their tongue right in there. And it's just an absolutely wonderful pollinator plant. It's extremely attractive. It has a nice long bloom time in July, and it's a host plant for rare species like the broad-lined Rastria moth. Silver checker spot butterflies also like to visit it. It's a great butterfly plant. It's also the host plant for the endangered mottled dusky wing. If you plant, unfortunately, the mottled dusky wing isn't quite like a monarch, where if you plant New Jersey tea, you will get a mottled dusky wing in your yard. They tend to be more restricted to different habitats, but still, it's planting New Jersey tea it's still good to get that plant back into the environment. You know, we used to have a lot more New Jersey tea in Ontario, and unfortunately, a lot of the prairies where it occurred in got plowed under. So there's really only a few areas where New Jersey tea is common. So it's a great plant to include into your garden. Native honeysuckles are really good for moths. Honeysuckles like the common snowberry, the northern bush honeysuckle, the glaucous honeysuckle are host plants for clearwing moths like the snowberry clearwings. Raspberries are a great moth plant as well. Hologram moths, raspberry crown borers, they all feed on the foliage of raspberries. So planting a few raspberries is really good. Grapes and Virginia creeper is really good as well. They're host plants for moths like the Pandora sphinx. Ferns host moths as well. So pink shaded fern moth, silver spotted fern moth host on ferns. If you could include some ferns, you'll be providing moth plants. Native grasses and sedges, a lot of species like these twirlers here feed exclusively on grasses and sedges. I mentioned milkweeds earlier and how important they are for bees and for wasps. They're also really important for moths. So common milkweed here, you'll get, if you have it blooming in your yard, you'll almost definitely get hummingbird clearwings and squash vine borers and things like that visiting it. So it's just a really, really wonderful plant to include in your garden. Same with wild bergamot. These are all kind of simple, common plants, but they're really, really important for insects and are visited by a wide variety of pollinators. Evening primrose, again, they're visited by moths like the primrose moth. The caterpillars of the primrose moth feed only on the seed capsules of evening primrose. So including evening primrose will hopefully get moths like the primrose moth to come visit your yard. Asters, sunflowers, and goldenrods are very important for bees. They're very important for moths as well. And a lot of moths, around 200 species or so, feed on goldenrod foliage. More moth-friendly flowers include stuff like, you know, foxglove beard tongue, common yarrow, cylindrical blazing star, Joe pie weed, field thistle. Plants that are good for bees are also good for moths, and they're all visited by the same insects. So including a variety of species like this in your garden will support moths. And messy lawns are really good for supporting moths as well. So I mentioned before that dandelion, you know, it's a forage for bees, but it's not the best. Same with caterpillars. You know, we have woolly bears that'll feed on dandelion. There's also a few species like this leaf roller that'll feed on clovers. So including clovers and dandelions, or allowing them to occur on the edge in your lawn will support insects. It's not as good as planting native plants, but it is supporting them, so it should be encouraged. And again, leave the leaves. So a lot of our moths, like the Polyphemus and this hummingbird clearing moth, they overwinter in the pupal stage, which is the moth equivalent of a chrysalis, and they'll overwinter in leaf litter on the ground or underneath loose soil. So leaving messy areas in your garden will support insects. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about my gardens that I have. I don't want to go on for too long, but I want to talk first where I got my plants. So I started my garden, it's going to be in its 4th year now. And the first year I got seed from the wildflower farm. Let's see. Yeah, so I got seed from the wildflower farm, from the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance, and I collected a lot of them myself. That's the seed capsule of evening primrose, which is really, you'll probably see that everywhere in any ditch. You can collect a few heads of that and you've got hundreds of seeds, and you can get a native plant garden started from those. So I collected all of these seeds, I mixed them together, and I basically seeded them in my lawn. So my process, so in 2018, I removed all of the sod on my parents' side yard. I added 10 layers of newspaper to suppress any weeds that might be in the seed bed, and then added 6 inches of soil on top of that, seeded my wildflower mix. And then last year, I added a whole bunch of plugs from Grow Wild, the native plant nursery in Omimi. And that just kind of helped to fill in areas where plants weren't coming up. On my parents' yard, you can see here, I added some signage. So for the first little while when plants were getting started, you couldn't tell if there was any flowers or anything. And I didn't want people to complain, so I put up these pollinator habitat signs. The pollinator habitat one you can get from the Xerxes Society, but then there's the Monarch Way Station sign, certified wildlife friendly habitat. These are all signs you can find online, and I just included them to kind of help people sort of understand what we were doing. I also got inspiration from my neighbors. So this is Marla. Marla is a PFN member. She used to be the editor of The Orchid, and she's one of my neighbors. So I wanted to see what plants she had. So she had cup plant, and she had buttonbush, and she had all these different types of milkweeds and stuff like that. And so I planted cup plant, and I planted buttonbush and stuff in my yard to kind of increase our local population of those plants. So I'm going to show you my gardens kind of briefly here. I planted 3 gardens. So I planted a shade garden, a rain garden, and a prairie garden. The woodland shade garden is kind of on a north-facing side, and I planted, it doesn't get a lot of sun. It gets about 4 to 6 hours. I would say more, maybe 3 to 6 hours of sun. Some areas get a little bit more sun than others. So I planted a wide variety of plants that do good in the shade. So different woodland plants. You can see here, I mentioned green mulch earlier. So this is my green mulch. I planted cherries and dogwoods, alternate leaf dogwood on the side here. And then in between these trees, because the trees are going to take a long time to mature, I planted a lot of wild strawberry and Virginia waterleaf. And this whole mat, this was only from a few plugs, and in one season, they spread out everywhere. This was taken in the fall of last year, but they spread out and are really doing wonderful, and are kind of helping to suppress weeds. Virginia waterleaf, if you plant that, it'll take care, it will suppress any weeds that you'd have coming into your garden. It's a really, really good plant to plant. This is just sort of a legend, just to kind of give you an idea of what I did. I don't know if anybody wants to screenshot that for later, but this is the north-facing side along the sidewalk. I planted stuff like showy tick trefoil and little blue stem, zigzag goldenrod, stuff like that, northern bush honeysuckle, a whole bunch of common blue violet. Most of these were either from seed or they were from Grow Wild. I just added a whole bunch of plugs, and they're taking off really, really well. So just as some garden inspiration for you guys. Next to that, so heading east, or yeah, heading west from that garden, I have rain garden. And what I did with the rain garden, if you notice this red line here, I created kind of what I would call a bioswale. So it's this, there's a little ledge that goes off the sidewalk and it dips down about 1 foot. And then I have my rain gutters that go into it. So it basically fills up with water and kind of creates this little swale that collects rainwater. And so in that spot, I was able to plant species that like it a little bit moister. So I was able to plant swamp milkweed and cardinal flower and blue vervain and stuff like that, right next to, you know, black-eyed Susan and primrose and wild bergamot, stuff that I planted from seed that maybe likes it a little bit drier. So I could have plants that like a dry area and plants that like a wet area right next to each other in the same area. This is what the rain garden looks like in early June. So we have that big tall plant there is cut leaf coneflower, also known as green-headed coneflower. It's a fantastic plant for a rain garden. It's a little bit aggressive, but if you don't mind that, then it's a great plant. Hoary vervain there. This is the rain garden here in July, so you can see a lot of wild bergamot, and then that spot where that red spot right there is the cardinal flower, and that dips down about 1 foot, and it's just kind of a wet puddle that is just perfect for wetland plants. So I was able to include wetland plants and dryland plants in the same area. This is showing the rain garden in the difference that a year could make. So in 2019, you can see the city was doing some construction there, but in 2019. That all that we were seeing is just stuff that I had seeded. So my wild bergamot and my primrose and stuff, none of that had come up the first year. A lot of black-eyed Susans bloomed, so it looked like we had some stuff going on, but nothing really bloomed for the second year. So this year is going to be the 3rd year that those plants will be there from seed. So this year will be even more different than last year was, and last year was already drastically different from 2019. So if you want to start something like this from seed, you know, you have to be a little bit patient, but it definitely pays off. Here's a closer look at that garden. Here's that same area in the fall. It just completely fills over, gets taken over by New England aster. New England aster is a great plant to include because it just kind of, it's sort of there during the year, but then in fall it really spreads out and takes over. So the cutleaf coneflower. Then finally, we had our tallgrass prairie garden. So this garden, it has a southern exposure and it gets the most sun. You can see, again, drastically different. First year, it was, in 2019, it was just black-eyed Susan with a little bit of primrose. And then 2020, the primrose ended up growing about 10 feet tall. So a huge difference, but again, plant stuff from seed and be patient, it will grow. So here's what the tallgrass prairie garden has. There's Indian grass and other species of grasses that I planted as plugs that will hopefully mature as the years go on. There's a lot of milkweed, a lot of wild bergamot, a lot of New England aster. And then for green mulch, in between the plants, I planted a lot of little blue stem grass and wild columbine. And one of my favorite plants I used for the green mulch is clammy ground cherry, which is a native member of the Solanaceae. So it's related to tomato plants. And it sort of looks like a tomato plant. It looks like a sprawling, creeping tomato plant. But it's clammy ground cherry, and it produces a little berry that you can eat, and the bees really like it. So I included that as green mulch around my prairie plants. In this garden, we've already seen 8 species of bumblebees. This is a 2-spotted bumblebee on the bergamot, but the wild bergamot really drives them out. So planting wild bergamot you're gonna get a lot of bees if you plant that. We ended up getting 8 species. I counted them last year, so it was pretty exciting stuff. Here's the garden in July when blazing star starts to bloom. Some New England aster. I leave the plants up during the winter. So here on one side, you can see on the left, that was taken last, I believe this was September, just before the New England aster bloomed. And then I leave everything up in the winter, and it's just great. It's great winter interest. Now, some of my mistakes. So I made a little bit of a mistake when I seeded it. That red arrow is pointing to Canada goldenrod. And I seeded in some Canada goldenrod, which is a native goldenrod species, which is, as I said, goldenrods are very beneficial. It's a great plant, but I seeded it, and it unfortunately took over a huge area of the garden. And so I didn't identify it the first year. I didn't know what it was. But last spring, I had to remove a ton of it and replace those areas with plugs because it was just way too aggressive. Same with oxeye sunflower, Heliopsis helianthoides, also known as sweet oxeye is another name. That was in my seed mixture, and it ended up just being way too aggressive. And I'm talking like, huge 5x5 areas of just this one plant. So I had to remove that to kind of get my diversity up a little bit. So you're gonna want to be wary of planting species that are too aggressive with species that are not very aggressive. A good idea is to kind of plant semi-aggressive species with semi-aggressive species, or plant like with like. So unfortunately, I planted a hyper-aggressive species with some less aggressive species, and it didn't work out for me very well. And then lastly, we really want to try to encourage people to build their own gardens. So I built this seed box. And essentially what this is it's just a box, and I collected a whole bunch of seed from the garden, and I'll do it again next year. And we put the seed into this box, and people can take it, and it has little instructions for them so they can make their own pollinator gardens. But really it's just, these are things that you can do with your own garden. I mean, include a way of sharing seeds or a way of kind of giving back to the community. That's what I did with this. So hopefully, as time goes on, more people will do this. I'm sure many of you already have pollinator gardens, but yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Hopefully I didn't go on too long. I was looking at the time right there. I tend to ramble a little bit. So, but yeah, thank you all very much, and I'll take your questions now.